Hi guys, so this is the Biomechanics and Skill Acquisition presentation, and we're going to be going over the application of external focus attention in learning to handstand. So to begin with, we're going to be looking at what external focus attention is, whether it enhances skill performance and the suggested mechanisms currently at hand, what handstand is and how external focus attention can be applied to it. Then we'll look at what the benefits and limitations of applying external focus attention, and finally, what should be considered in applying it to handstand balance. So what is it? Well, it's centered concentration of the senses outside of the body, so to the environment or the task, as opposed to the self. Okay, so it's focusing on the effect as opposed to the cause. It's often verbal in delivery. And sometimes analogies can be used as a type of implicit learning, in order to create an external focus of attention. And a common example in balancing is to be on a stabilometer, and the cue of external would be to keep the markers level, whereas an internal cue would be to keep the feet level. Okay, so examples of successful performance enhancements with external focus are going to be for balancing. This is stabilometer here, and it's shown that external cues can improve balance as opposed to internal. In movement kinematics, things like rowing technique, discus throw, and sprinting has all been shown to improve external focus of attention as opposed to internal, as well as efficiency, force production, and accuracy as well. So here's a table just identifying some of the balancing task studies, and I just want to bring your attention to the fact that the tasks are all very similar. Okay, some of them are dual task, and they've got visual constraints, but most of them are on a stabilometer. And also for many of them, there's not a control present as well. Okay, apart from a few of them here, but for the most part, there's no control present. So as we'll get into later, I think it's important to have a control here because one theory is the idea that the working memory gets overloaded. So having a control will be a good way of determining if that is the case. But as you can see, for the most part, the outcomes are supportive of external focus of attention. So now we'll look at the hypotheses for the mechanism of why it is effective. So on the one hand, we've got constrained action, which is by Nevin, Wolf, and other researchers. This is more of an ecological or dynamic perspective, which sort of founded out from functional variability in that there are many degrees of freedom available, and the system will automatically choose the degrees of freedom that are most optimal for the performance. It emphasizes the fact that movement becomes autonomous, focusing on the task, not the self, when external attention is given, and this is supported in balancing tasks by shorter reaction times and higher frequency adjustments, suggesting more reflexive control. And it also is sort of supported and is similar to the notion from Gibson, who discussed the perception action cycle. So the idea is with external focus attention, without that conscious processing, that cycle is very clear, and there's not the disturbances from focusing on the self. Okay, on the other hand, we've got the working memory overload hypothesis by Maxwell, Masters, Poulton, and other researchers. This is more of a cognitive behavioral perspective. It suggests that internal focus alongside with the outcome of the task, okay, which obviously the participants are usually familiar with because they can see whether or not they've done successfully in the task. This presents two pieces of information, and this leads to an increased cognitive load and ultimately an overload in the cognitive memory, working memory, and thus that's why performance is reduced. And this is supported by some research suggesting that secondary task loading reduces performance. And then we have more recently the Selfinvoked trigger hypothesis, which could potentially tie these two together, because we have it implies that when we're not focusing on the self, it's more autonomous, but it also implies that there's also less information as well. So it starts out with having a self schema, so thoughts, ideas, emotions that constitute the perception of the task in this case. And things that can stimulate the self schema are things like internal instructions, augmented feedback, environmental context, etc. So in both experiments within this paper, participants were asked to, or one group, the self group, was asked to reflect on the performance, on their personal performance, whereas the other group was asked to identify things in the environment at present, and they concluded that the group that had a self-focus performed worse and their performance degraded compared to the control group. And the paper suggests that awareness of self-activation rather is crucial to successful performance, but also its effective measurement of self-activation will greatly improve our understanding. So first of all, I mean, is it possible to measure self-activation? At the moment, I don't think so. So thus, can it not be falsified and therefore not be scientific according to that Popperian sort of philosophy of science? Also within the study, there was negative reflection as well, what sort of didn't go well, and this could have impaired performance, overweighing the positives and maybe giving them a sort of more negative mindset, which is shown to reduce skill acquisition. And so the present control group and also the past group, so I'd suggest that the present control group had a less cognitive load than the past self group, who had to reflect on their performance. So this could be one of the reasons why they did worse. So that would support more the working memory approach. Now we'll look into handstand. So what type of skill is a handstand? Well, from a general point, it is a closed skill. Okay, it's a discrete skill. There's a start and end. From an objective standpoint, there is a hold time, change in joint angle, change in center pressure. There's also a stylistic performance measurement as well, which is more subjective within gymnastics or within like acrobatics or performing, where you've got shape and grace. The goal really is to develop autonomous stability, okay, so we can stabilize without consciously trying to do so. And also we can apply environmental variability, do it on different surfaces and different objects and different environments to improve our overall performance. So the sort of three keys are sort of shape, timing, and tension. That's how I'll typically coach the handstand. So the technical model from a visual standpoint, as you can see here, we fix the gaze on a point. We then reach into that point. We kick and we try and find our balance, get our center of mass above our base of support and find that position. We then bring the legs together, push into the sky to create that straight line. And then from the front, and also the paper here by Gautier shows high expert levels. They will adjust more through the wrist and shoulders, whereas less expert performers will adjust more through the hips, okay, which is less desirable as a strategy to balance. Okay, now to be more descriptive. So we've got them 5 phases I discussed before. From there, the balance strategy is dependent on vestibular, visual, and somatosensory mechanisms. It's all about balancing the center of mass over the base support, predominantly the sagittal plane. Okay, so it's more anterior, posterior deviations that we're trying to control. And there's greater pressure, greater center pressure, motion or movement than there would be in standing. Suggested to be a 4-joint balance system as opposed to a 3-joint in standing. So we've got the wrist first, that's in the small deviations in center pressure, then the shoulder, and then if there's big displacements in the center pressure, then the elbow or hip may be used to try and balance. Okay, but ideally you want to be spending most time in the wrist and shoulder. So yeah, smaller hip amplitudes are present with an expert level as opposed to more hip-led balancing at a lower level. Typically there's proximal stiffness in the trunk and head. From a muscular standpoint, it's predominantly isometric contractions to keep the joints fixed and lengthened. The wrist flexors relatively produce the highest amount of muscle activity in joint torques. And interestingly, more advanced performers, they will use less overall EMG activity in all but the lats. Okay, this was only a couple of studies, but I did find that quite interesting. So how to apply it? Well, first of all, I think it's important to focus on one thing at a time. Okay, because this paper here shows that participants focused on one quality, developed that. So in case it increased the amount of height, I think with the football kick it might have been, and then their accuracy then improved once the height was stable. Okay, so certainly focusing on one cue or one instruction at a time, I think is important to not overload the working memory potentially. So a cue that I'd give if someone's doing a kick up against the wall would be the wall is glass. Grip the floor might be one for balancing, to get to use the wrist strategy to balance. Push the ceiling to imply that straight line. Reach to the line for a kick up, try and get that length on the kick, and to get them to sort of focus on a certain point they're reaching for. And then there's also a cliff edge analogy that I'll use as well. So once stable, we have further constraints, so we can move them further from the wall. We can spot, not spot, change the surface, close the eyes to overload other balancing systems. And again, I think it's important to allow variability as long as the outcome is still achieved. Okay, when do we apply it? Typically, the examples that have been given here in the studies are instructional, but I think also using its feedback can be good. It just does require some creativity. So, seeing that someone, is not lengthening, then maybe we give them that cue of pushing to the ceiling. And that would be the external cue to drive that constraint, to constrain them to perform the skill in the way we think is most optimal. And here's some other examples. Okay, so now we can get into the advantages and limitations. So we'll start with the advantages. So the strong supporting evidence for an external focus retention across various skills, not just balancing, and also across various cohorts. It's been shown to improve short-term retention. It's very simple. It encourages autonomous implicit learning. Getting past its focus on the outcome and not necessarily consciously processing too much. And also it can be useful in high pressure situations to stimulate autonomous control. So if a athlete is, the context is very strenuous, there's lots of fans or something like this, there's a lot of pressure on the performance, then being able to apply that external focus may allow the athlete to be less self-invoked and focus on the task at hand. Limitations. So in elite performers, in elite acrobats with a balancing task, they were actually shown that compared to a control group, they reduced their performance with an external focus compared to the control. So that's interesting. Only one paper, but it'd be interesting to explore that further. And there's no clear and falsifiable mechanism. Conscious focus at the moment can't be measured objectively. There's limited study design procedure for balancing tasks as well. Most of them are on the stabilometer. So can this be generalized to things like handstands? It's measured only as instructions. So does that mean the findings are applicable and reproducible in the setting of giving feedback to your clients or athletes? And the effects have also not been analysed to date among the long-term skill development, which is obviously where we're spending most of our time. Okay, and some considerations. Most of the research is on the stabilometer. So as I said, is it relevant still for handstand? Also, we need to be mindful not to give too much information because this could cancel the effects of any of the information that's given if we overload the system, overload the athlete, the system. Applying the research to practice is quite a difficult thing to do as well. So coaches are reported to rely quite heavily on internal cues in track and field. And coaches may also not be aware of the instructions and feedback they're giving. So there's an example here in rowing where I think 4 British rowing coaches were asked to reflect on their performance as a coach and the sort of things that they said, and their perception of what they said compared to what was actually said was actually quite off, which I found really interesting. So it brings up that notion of perception versus reality. So I think it's very interesting to consider that in applying this. Making the shift to effortless learning, as discussed previously, it requires creativity to formulate these external cues that are going to still be effective for the learner and relevant. And it may take some patience from a coaching standpoint and from an athlete standpoint to remove old habits. And then practicality. So as I said, most of the research has looked at instructions. So first, will it be relevant as a feedback tool? Is it still effective? And also, let's take that time, but if it is relevant and it is effective, to develop these cues. Okay, now for summary and key takeaways, the external focus of attention does appear to enhance successful skill acquisition and retention across a range of tasks, but the mechanism is relatively unclear. So by directing attention to the environment opposed to self, this should lead to more autonomous learning. That's what the theories and that's what the research seems to be pointing towards. However, no research to date has analysed the effects of internal versus external focus attention on handstand balance performance. So this is really just a best guess. So more research would have to be done there to determine that. So wrist balancing seems to be the most, wrist followed by shoulder balancing seems to be the most optimal for keeping the centre pressure displacement small and for having an optimal position in a handstand. So, how can we apply external focuses of attention in order to drive this? Okay, from there, we've got visual constraints such as closing the eyes, have a large impact on handstand performance. So this can be another constraint that we can add to the athlete to get them to focus on a certain particular external constraint or even to overload their system. And finally, more research is also required among elite app performers and elite athletes with no directional focus as a control, just to establish if the direction is actually impairing their performance. So, if we have a control group, we can see if, is it that there's too much conscious loading for them when we give them a certain cue, because they may already have a very successful organization strategy, very successful attractive states that allow them to perform the particular skill that's being done. Okay. And finally, the importance of considering the order of research and theories for phenomena. So when looking through the research, it's been interesting to see how these different theories have come about and the timeline of them as well. Okay, I think if I didn't take as much time to sort of see the dates and look at how it's been formulated, it would have been quite confusing to see, where's this come from? How have they determined that that's the way things are? Whereas when you see, the research group and you see the developments of the theories that have come, in chronological order, it can be quite interesting to get a deeper understanding of what's going on. Thanks very much for watching. These are the references.